patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 141 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this solo episode. Hope you are all having a fantastic start of spring. Don't think spring is officially here yet, but let's just say it is, and it means rejuvenation and new growth. So that is what we are all about here on the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. Be sure to check out links down in the show notes below. I've got a couple links I'll refer to in this episode, so be sure to check those out at the end of this solo recording. We do also have a new email subscription format, so if you want to check out the new format for our monthly emails, you can also subscribe down in the show notes below. As many of you will know, this show covers a lot about different episodes where we had major divisions and how people came together to resolve differences. I believe this is a really important theme that we have for the show, and it's really because of all of you who listen in and who want to make a difference on ensuring that we have more civility and more discussion, better political discourse for the future. And after speaking with a lot of people, there's one theme that comes out a lot, which is this the most polarizing time in American history? I think that's a very, very valid question, because when you're caught up in an episode of polarization, you often feel trapped. You feel like there's no way out. You feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Well, today I want to cover a historic diplomatic episode that maybe some of you have heard of before. I first learned about it back right around 4th or 5th grade American history, and this was a topic that you would just cover for the sake of learning about American history and would never look back at it. But now here we are in 2024, and I am looking back at this episode, and this diplomatic episode is called the XYZ Affair. Let's go back to the 1790s, because this is where our story begins. After the United States establishes the Constitution and starts getting going with the Washington administration, as much as we like to think that everything was so well put together, we had a few problems abroad, which is a fascinating topic of itself just because of how many crazy things were happening domestically. But anyway, back in the early 1790s, the French were dealing with their own revolution, the French Revolution. And of course, that was not a very pretty time, especially if you were just trying to exercise free speech rights. It was probably not a great idea at the time. Nevertheless, the French always had a feeling that the Americans were not repaying the French help that they gave during the American Revolution. And at first, you would think, oh, that's quite understandable because you have a new country that's being established. You don't really have the finances completely in order. But I will just say this just as a personal note here. I studied in the UK, and of course, you interact a lot with people from France. So this is a kind acknowledgement to my French friends and colleagues. But when it comes to French politics, I just have to say, it feels like French politics just never operates without making a mess for everybody else. So it's just a little comment here, and I hope that maybe at the end of this episode you'll agree with me a little bit more than perhaps you did back in the early part of this episode. The French were not so pleased at this idea that Americans were not doing anything, and the French had this really, really clever idea that turned out to be not so clever. They started to take hold of American merchant ships in the Caribbean and elsewhere. You see, the French were not so happy that the Americans were essentially practicing trade with countries on a so-called neutral position, in that the Americans were trading with the British, the French, the Dutch, and just about anybody else you can name. And partly because I think the Americans were really trying to establish trade relations, trying to figure out what our relationship is going to look like with all these countries. And of course, people would be benefiting from trade with other nations. With the Jay Treaty in 1794, that the French really saw as an insult to the historic relations between France and the Americans, the French decided to embark on this rather insulting and very offensive, and I would say very jerky way of doing things. And this has really concerned the Americans a lot. It was under the Adams administration where a lot of this really started to come into place. Not just really on the resolution part, which will eventually come, but it really was in the middle of this conflict that almost led to a full-on conflict with our former allies. In 1797, John Adams is dealing with this problem, and the cabinet, of course, with Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, they are not so pleased with what the French are doing, obviously, and politically this is not very, very good if people knew a lot about what was happening. And so the Adams administration starts sending some people to talk with the French diplomats. The diplomats on the American side were three individuals, one of whom we've actually covered in an episode, for the Sacred Honor series. The three diplomats were Charles Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry being one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from Massachusetts. So yes, he was involved in this, and he probably would have regretted getting involved in this, as I'll explain a little later. But in July 1797, this diplomatic commission goes to France and to speak with these French people and ask what in the world is going on here, and can we get a resolution? Now, I'm going to use some French because I did take French classes for a number of years, so I'm going to try to exercise this to the best of my ability here. On the French side, we have three individuals, but I'll start with the French foreign minister, who is not one of the three individuals. But the French foreign minister, his name was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. I'll keep it simple and call him Talleyrand, which is what he was kind of known to be called, I guess, in that time, and nowadays with historians and commentators. The three individuals on the French side or the three counterparts, I should say, were Jean-Conrad Oettinger, Pierre Bellamy, and Lucien Oteval. So those three are the French envoys who were meeting the three Americans. And the French, especially with Talleyrand, thought that they were going to really get a good deal. And this is not, by the way, this is a lesson of what not to do in a negotiation, which is to completely not know what you're doing and think that you're just going to get a free grab at everything you want. It's just never going to happen. The number one rule in any sort of negotiation. However, the Talleyrand has this deal, and he tells the Americans via the envoys, he says first, and this is information, by the way, from the Monticello site, which is interesting because Thomas Jefferson will make an appearance, and he's not going to be so pleased with what's going on. But thanks to the Monticello website, they provide a lot of good information here. So Talleyrand has three conditions here. First, the American diplomats need to essentially apologize for how Adams described the French. And Adams was not very fond of the French. In fact, he was a lot more supportive of the British, in part because of his history as a lawyer. And if you recall from that John Adams episode a long, long time ago, well, it feels like a long time ago, but Adams basically represented the British during the Boston Massacre trials. And it wasn't that he was sympathetic with the British in terms of the cause for the Americans. It was just that he had previously worked for the British, and he was just tended to favor more on the British side. And so that was the first condition, essentially an apology for saying bad things about the French. The second condition was that the American diplomats had to give Talleyrand the equivalent of about $250,000, which is a ton of money, I say, not just in terms of the amount, but given the fact that the French have been seizing American ships and they want money, I think it's a little rich for a side like that. Now, for the French, this was pretty typical, actually. I don't know the specifics of how these bribes and payments worked, but this is essentially a bribe. I mean, the French are essentially asking the Americans to say, give us some money, say sorry, and everything's going to be just fine. And the final condition is that the French wanted the American diplomats to give France a large loan so that France, of course, could use them for their own expenditures. France, by the way, had been dealing with a conflict in Europe. It just seems like over and over again, Europe has all these conflicts. And so France probably saw the U.S. as a bit of like a loan shark, or I guess a venture capitalist, and wanted a loan and wanted the U.S. to pay claims by these American merchants who were losing their ships, have them pay France for ships that France had seized after the J Tree, which I just mentioned earlier. Basically, this is a really, really bad deal. And this is probably just not my opinion, but the envoys are absolutely not going to do things like that. And this was not a deal that was agreed to. The Americans decided to keep negotiations going. They tried with informal talks to try to work things out. Eventually, Gary was the only one who stayed around, and I kind of feel sorry for him because that would not have been a fun time to not only be around a bunch of rowdy French politicians, but also he was not going to be viewed very favorably after the XYZ affair. And during all this time, John Adams is trying to tell Congress to build up the military. Long story short, but the U.S. Navy was not even really in a position to be a Navy, in part because the U.S. Navy was very temporary. At the time, the U.S. really saw the Navy as something that was to be used at kind of emergency times, at times when you needed a full military force to be able to defend the country. And while it had been renewed a couple times and basically just the United States government saying, oh, let's just build some ships here, and that'll count as a Navy. Certainly hardly a Navy at all at any point in American history or in any part of world history. But that was the mentality about the U.S. military. And so Adams is really trying to convince Congress to get ready for the possibility of war. And we now call this time where there was a possibility of war with France called the quasi-war. During this time, Adams is trying to do what he can in Congress, but and even though the Federalists have all this power, remember, John Adams was a Federalist, even though the Federalists had all this power in Congress, they met a lot of opposition from the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans were led by none other than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, just to kind of review on what the vice president was doing, Thomas Jefferson was not only the leader of the Democratic Republicans, he was also the vice president, because at the time, the vice president and the president were elected on different tickets. So there was, I guess, an unofficial recognition that the vice president could be very different than the president in terms of policy. And it was because of things like this that really led to that change. Jefferson was very, 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 very unhappy with what's going on. Jefferson was a lot more favorable for the French. He had actually even played some kind of role in, I guess, whether it was informal, formal, I can't remember, but he played some kind of role with the French government for during the French Revolution. And Jefferson is seeing the Adams administration as an administration that is overreacting, that simply wants to build up war, build up capabilities for greater conflict with the French. And the partisanship really, really started to come around as more and more skepticism was coming out about what the Adams administration was doing and what the communications were like with these American envoys. And with a lot more scrutiny, a lot more questions being asked about the dispatches, eventually Adams allows these dispatches to eventually start coming out so that Congress can really scrutinize and see what is happening with these negotiations, as well as the communications between the Americans and the French. We now call this the XYZ Affair because to protect the anonymous nature of the three French envoys, Adams essentially replaces their names respectively in the order I just gave you for the three French envoys, X, Y, and Z. He gets Congress to take a look, and people are absolutely shocked, especially the Democratic Republicans. There was a lot of, I will say just generally, there was a lot of surprise at how the French are behaving. So I want to kind of make that clear because some people might see this as like, well, the Federalists probably were very much against the French, and all the Democratic Republicans were like, oh, go France. Like that wasn't the case. There was clearly a lot of anger towards the French. The problem is that this really, really became very, very divisive within Congress, within the two parties. I say within the two parties, I mean among the two parties, not necessarily within, although there were probably certain divisions that were happening within the two major parties, just as with any major issue. But even public opinion started coming out, and the people were absolutely outraged against France. John Adams actually was viewed very favorably because of this, and the Federalists ran on this whole thing of building up the military, being prepared for anything, and ensuring that we had national security, having some sort of security and defense for our nation, especially given the reasons I just mentioned about how the U.S. Navy was pretty much not and really anywhere near the kind of Navy that we envision nowadays. And with this buildup, Jefferson is not only being vocal about this. There's accusations of Adams and the Federalists being traitors. There are episodes of unrest. There was so much that was happening at the time, and I won't go into detail of specific episodes here, but the point is that people were really, really at each other's throats during this time. You have people who, on one side, were saying, no, the French are acting so badly that the French are essentially, from their view, French are trying to instigate some kind of conflict. We need to do everything we can to defend ourselves and make sure that we don't get into another conflict. On the other side, you have people who are saying, this is not the course of action to take. We need to properly deal with the French. We don't think the French should be enemies. There's probably a number of people, including Jefferson, who agreed that we should have closer relations with the French and not with the British, who we just fought in the American Revolution. So you can see that there's clearly a lot of dispute and a lot of disagreement on how the United States should manage international affairs. Jefferson wrote to James Madison, as he always or often did with a lot of these fellow founding fathers, in a letter dated March 29th, 1798, Jefferson went to a point where he wanted to ensure a Congress was going to be stopped and prevented from doing anything for as long as possible. A quote from the letter says, the quote, "The question of war and peace depends now on a toss of cross and pile. If we could but gain the season, we should be saved. The affairs of Europe would of themselves relieve us," unquote. To have this sort of language to say that this is all about war and peace and that this could be the difference in how American politics would move forward, it was a really big statement. And nonetheless, this partisan rancor still continued. It got to a point where you're not going to believe this. And this is something, again, I didn't really pick up when I was learning about the XYZ affair at the time. When Adams and the Federalists ran on this affair, they really gained a lot of seats, and they won heavily in the 1798 midterm elections. After that election, the administration and the Federalist Party essentially passed, with the Adams administration and the Congress, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, in short, really restricted immigration to the United States, but also gave the federal government a lot of powers to be able to get rid of anyone who spoke out against the administration, especially in the wake of the XYZ affair. Some states were so enraged at this resolution that they passed within their states their own condemnations of the Alien Sedition Acts. Two resolutions came out very strongly from Kentucky and Virginia. And who would have guessed that the Virginia resolution was initially drafted by none other than Thomas Jefferson, as well as with the help of James Madison. Both of these men were especially angry, but I would say that James Madison was more upset at the constitutional element, believing that the federal government didn't really have that constitutionality to do what it did with the Alien Sedition Acts. Jefferson went even further, which I am not surprised about, given that Jefferson is more of the intellectual and is a lot more fervently into this partisanship that we've seen with the XYZ affair. Jefferson goes so far as to bring out the issue of nullification, which is this argument that states could just ignore certain federal laws. And remember, the Supreme Court hadn't even stepped in regarding the powers of Congress and whatnot. So at an early stage, this is very new, this idea of nullification. But even though people like Madison were not on board with this idea of nullification, Jefferson really started this thought process of states just saying, we're just going to ignore this law because we don't like it and we don't think it's lawful. Before we get to the ramifications of the XYZ affair, I'll talk a little bit about the ending, and then we'll go straight into the consequences of this diplomatic episode. The first is that the quasi-war ends in 1800 because Adams is working on negotiations with the French. Again, they're building up the Navy, building up the Marine Corps, which actually emerged from this. In many ways, this affair really led to more of a military buildup in later years and decades. But the French government eventually knew that they weren't able to get these demands, in part because of negotiations that were happening. The French government decided to not have the demands anymore. They took away those demands. And by 1800, there was a convention called the Convention of 1800, but essentially created a treaty called the Treaty of Montfontaine to essentially ensure of more peace. Although the problem is Adams really never got the fruits of that victory at the time of the election of 1800, in part because of the views that the Democratic Republicans put out, especially with those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions I mentioned. Eventually leads to Thomas Jefferson becoming president, defeating John Adams in that rematch, actually, from 1796. And Jefferson, obviously seen as a more pro-French president, the episode really dies down in terms of the tensions between France and the United States. This obviously does not mean the end of the impact of the XYZ affair. And through looking at some sources, I've found just a handful. I'm sure there's a lot more out there, but probably not enough to fit in one solo episode. I'm just going to list a few of the consequences of the XYZ affair and why the XYZ affair taking place over just a 2-year span, 1797 and 1798, is so critical for understanding the American political environment then, and I would say in the present. The first is, of course, the election of 1800. It was probably the first really big divisive election that we've had for the White House. The second is the eventual demise of the Federalist Party. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were the two major parties at this time during the XYZ affair, and the Federalists would actually realize what would happen when they don't keep up this promise of building up for the military and preparing for war, because one of the reasons why the Federalist Party eventually dissipated was because of their opposition to the War of 1812. That was a conflict with the British, and there were certainly many among the Federalist Party who wanted to have good or close relations with the British at the time, therefore opposed the war, and it really ended with their downfall, despite the fact that the War of 1812 really didn't have a clear victor. The third is, I mentioned nullification, and I would say, especially given the great sources I've looked at so far, that the arguments that came out of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions led to more nullification crises that later happened. Some of you might recall the nullification crisis under President Andrew Jackson's administration, when South Carolina did not want to have those tariffs put on the states. All became a whole thing with called the nullification crisis. But nullification also became an argument for the reasons why states seceded from the Union right before the Civil War. It is really amazing to see how that sort of event, of a diplomatic episode happening in the previous century, leading up to unfortunately, the bloodiest and I would say the most tragic conflict that America has ever seen. The fourth, I would say, it was this ability for the Congress to authorize military action without a declaration of war. The Supreme Court, with some rulings later on, essentially validated this for Congress. I can't remember what exactly those rulings were like, but this was probably not just the only time that the Supreme Court gave Congress these powers. I mean, if you recall, maybe from your history lessons, Congress does have implied powers through rulings like McCulloch v. Maryland, which is that big case that really essentially gave Congress these powers of that could be implied from the Constitution, not have to be written down. But there's so many instances. You think of all these major conflicts that have occurred since that time, especially conflicts that involve the United States. A lot of those in different episodes of involvement probably wouldn't happen without the XYZ affair and the consequences that came out of it. One of the other big consequences, of course, as I alluded to just a little bit earlier, is the buildup of the U.S. Navy and the creation of the United States Marine Corps. Because people realized at the time that, it might be a good idea that we have more than just a few ships that really can't do anything. We have to have an actual branch of the military to be able to defend American interests at sea, which was important then and obviously is still important nowadays. So just reflecting on the XYZ affair, I would say this is probably one of the most consequential partisanship episodes we have ever seen in American history. I know that in American history, there's so many points in time when you can say, oh, this would have happened if this didn't happen, or this wouldn't have happened if this happened. The XYZ affair, I think, no doubt, in my mind, is probably one of the first big partisan moments in American history. And I would argue that some of those ramifications have led to the kind of partisanship we have seen recently. If you recall, several years ago, our country has been divided, or was divided then, still divided now, on the allegations of Russia influencing the 2016 election, which is in of itself, I think, is reminiscent of those debates that we saw back in the 1790s. Whether or not people realize that this whole idea of foreign interference, or this concept of foreign interference, not limited to Russia, China has been in part of that discussion and all that. Whether those threats are real or fabricated, these are really parts of our partisanship history. So it's just important for us to be able to reflect on the historical elements before we get to a point where we can start having civil discussions and conversations. 225 plus years later, after the XYZ affair, how do we think about that episode and what we can take from that crazy time? Firstly, we need to recognize that major episodes of polarization and partisanship last for a long time. It's not just the duration of polarization and partisanship, it really is the impact it has on political discourse. The truth is, there is no quantifiable way to say this partisanship is affecting this political discourse by this amount or that amount. There's no way you can measure that. But what you can measure, though, is how people feel about political discourse. I always say that the way you act mirrors your ideology, or at least how people perceive that ideology. It's one thing for people to have an ideology that has good policies or bad policies, good ideas, bad ideas. But the way people perceive others, interesting enough, might not have to do a whole lot with whether they're good policies or bad policies, however you want to objectively or subjectively look at them. It's about how people are treating you, how people are respecting you. But one can't gain respect without showing respect. And this is one of the lessons I hope people can take, is when we look at this episode of Partisanship with the XYZ Affair, there could have been a genuine conversation about the U.S. military buildup. There could have been a genuine conversation about the state of American national security. Maybe not the way I described it, certainly not as complex and sophisticated as we understand national security, but there could have been genuine discussions, a genuine public conversation about the role of the United States, especially in the wake of the American Revolution, when we have two great powers, France and Britain. How do we manage our relations? How do we have good conversation about the role of the U.S. in maintaining trade relations, or perhaps with security, or perhaps with outside territories, or whatever that subject is? Could there have been an honest discussion? And while you can't expect that there's going to be civility everywhere, I do feel that there could have been a lot that could have been mitigated a lot of this partisanship. I believe Jefferson, I think, even though he was very pro-French, I think he could have acted a lot better, especially since he was vice president, especially since he was the head of the Democratic Republican Party. He could have played a much better role in having more robust discussions on the future of American foreign policy. Unfortunately, it really descended, I think, to a lack of leadership. I think a lack of understanding of both sides. And it's understandable that people are going to have those passions. There's no question. We don't want to say that everyone back in the past should have known this or should have known that, because then it's a little unfair. Then it's a little unfair because hindsight's 2020. However, the mannerisms that people could have taken probably could have led to a lower of the temperature, and certainly probably with the help of some very, very smart people in the Adams administration and in Congress, some more level-headed people, I should say. And unfortunately, I say this partly as a joke, but there are probably not that many level-headed French politicians who could help with this situation. But that's a whole other lesson and a whole other complaint about French politics for another time. When I was researching the XYZ affair for this episode, even I couldn't initially imagine what the consequences of this diplomatic affair was. When I looked at some of these sources that were saying everything from the Congress's authority to implement some kind of military action without declaration of war, to the nullification issue, these were things I didn't even think about. To be honest, this episode really was a lesson for me on the consequences of partisanship and how they can last so long, even to the next century, even 225 plus years later. The XYZ affair still matters. And I wonder how people thought of the XYZ affair at the time. Did people think that this was going to later evolve into other issues, notably nullification? And certainly people in the South certainly knew that nullification was going to be an issue, and that's something they could bring up. But that's the first takeaway I want to offer. The second, I believe this is likely the most important, and it's that we need to focus on the learning lessons at times of polarization. Whatever those learning lessons are, I can't articulate exactly what they are to you or to someone else. However, I hope it's a learning lesson about American politics. I can certainly tell you that the partisanship that I've seen over the last several years, it's very discouraging. There's no denying it. Within those times of partisanship, though, I learned about a new law, or I learn about a new member of Congress whom I never heard of before. I learn about that neighbor across the street who I never met, but who apparently shares some very insightful views on American politics. I get to know better the views of a best friend about our elections. The point is there's always someone or something that you can learn from at these times of partisanship. It doesn't have to always be a time of depression. It does not always have to be a time when you are discouraged. Think about the things that you can do in your community. Think about the new law that you never heard of. I always say in social science, there's a concept called path dependency. And what it essentially means is that history matters, that what happens in the past is going to limit options for the present and the future, because what happens in the past, of course, is going to determine the outcomes and the choices and the things we do as a result of that event. XYZ Affair, of course, is a great example. Without that diplomatic episode, as bad as it was, and I certainly am bad with a capital B, as bad as that episode was, perhaps we wouldn't be as enlightened or as willing to make things better in our society. We might not have been able to have that drive to end slavery after the Civil War. Maybe we would never have been incentivized to make change in Congress. Think about the major turning points in our history. From the election of 1876, probably one of the most divisive presidential elections. I mentioned the election of 1800. Think about how important that election was. The election of 1876 eventually led to the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which was most recently amended at the end of 2022 after the 2020 election and all the crazy events that happened afterwards. In the middle of 2020, the Trump administration was considering the Insurrection Act of 1807, which is an act that is more than 200 years old. It's pretty remarkable how it shows up in the news media at that time. It was not enacted by the administration, but that is just an example of how one can learn, including myself when I was watching the news. I had to look up specifically what the Insurrection Act of 1807 was, and I learned something from that. The point of this takeaway is there's always something to learn, even when things are so divisive. I wish that people during the time of the XYZ affair maybe had some more open-mindedness, shall we say, a little bit more understanding that French politics is as crazy as it sounds. Nevertheless, I do believe that people at the time, some people maybe learned lessons. Perhaps it affected the way that they governed later on in their careers. Maybe there was a little boy or a little girl at the time who decided to do things differently in the future because of what they saw. Acts or episodes of partisanship can really shape generations. Perhaps the generations that witness partisanship will remember those times when it was so bad that they will do everything they can to make American politics even more sustainable political environment. And that is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. Enjoy the rest of your day and rest of your week, and remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.